With a career spanning over 35 years, Christy Coleman has served as the Chief Executive Officer of some of the nation's most prominent museums. She's a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative correction, diversity, and inclusiveness. Ms. Coleman is an innovator and leader in the museum field, having held leadership roles at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, and the American Civil War Museum. She now serves as the executive director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. She's written numerous articles, is an accomplished screenwriter, public speaker, and has appeared on several national news and history programs. She served as the history consultant for the award-winning film Harriet and Showtime's Good Lord Bird. She's also appeared in award-winning documentaries, Abraham Lincoln, Grant, Neutral Ground, and When the Monuments Came Down. Ms. Coleman is the recipient of numerous awards for her decades of impact, including 3 honorary doctorates. In 2018, Time magazine named her one of the 31 people changing the South. And in 2019, Worth magazine named her one of 29 women changing the world. Please welcome Christy Coleman.
Soft chairs.
Well, Christy, thanks so much for coming and chatting with us today. I really appreciate it. We have only had a conversation over Zoom about a year ago for the opening of our Liberation and Freedom Day event. It was the last time you and I spoke. So I'm really excited to sort of dig into some of these ideas. And so what I did in preparation was go through the sort of public record, some of the things that you said. And so, because I think they frame a lot of what we are going to be seeing and talking about as the conference unfolds. So one of the first things that I want to sort of lift up for you and have you sort of comment on is this, one of your quotes was, we'll never get right with each other until we get our history right. And that's something that you said in about 2013.
I say it a lot. It's sort of a mantra that I like to share. And part of the reason for that is that, you know, we are generations that have been given deliberately incomplete histories, right? And so my whole career has been about correcting that. And what I have found is that when people really have a reckoning with the nuance and the depth of this shared history, they have a better appreciation and a better empathy. They have a stronger understanding of the systemic things that continue to oppress communities, particularly communities of color and the poor. So without it, we are lost. It's like trying to get a tree to stand where the roots are right? And so, again, part of my desire has always been, you know, let's get it right. Because, you know, one of the other things that I say a lot is, if we don't, it's kind of like, we all know we got that drunk uncle, right? And he can be abusive, he can be fun, he can be a whole lot of things, but we got that drunk uncle. And here's the problem, is that we can either choose to ignore it, not talk about it, not talk about the harm that may have been caused by that individual, or we choose to address the fact that in our family, alcoholism may be a problem, that we may be subjected to it. So I think of history kind of the same way. We got a drunk uncle named Sam. And Sam's caused some harm, you know, but we love Sam, right? We love him. But he causes harm. And so unless we deal with the roots of that harm, unless we really understand the history, then we can't get right with each other. We walk through this sort of fantasy of reconciliation. And I would argue you can't reconcile something you've never really dealt with, right?
So in your career, 35 years,
I started when I was 17.
I know.
That's the truth, though. That's the truth.
Because I think that is kind of where we need to start, really, is with you as a 17-year-old, right? Because there's a certain kind of recognition that, tell us what you were doing at 17. Let's start there.
Sure, I mean, you know, what was I doing at 17? I was a 17-year-old, a senior in high school. I had a lot of interests. I grew up in the church, so the requirement of doing right and doing good in the community was a mainstay. Even though I would actually have open disagreements with our pastor about interpretation of scripture, which was really interesting because, you know, Baptists don't like that. At least they didn't when I was growing up, especially from at that time, I think I started annoying him when I was around 13 with questions, well, why is this? Didn't God mean that? Well, why would he do this, right? So always a really inquisitive kid, and I had a lot of different talents. I did very well in school. That was a requirement, right? That was a requirement. I was very active in student organizations and sports. And I loved theater. And I loved theater and performance and acting and all of that. And so the summer between my junior and senior year in high school, my drama teacher I grew up in Williamsburg. So I'm not born there, but I grew up there. My family moved there when I was 9. And so all of this history was in my backyard. What was interesting about it at that time was that, and there were a lot of black people that worked at Colonial Williamsburg, mostly in the hotel and restaurants division, but there were a lot of black people in the historic area back then. And they were skilled tradesmen. I mean, the master silversmith was a black man named Mr. Curtis, Mr. Jimmy Curtis, and the master wheelwright were a series of brothers and family from from Charles City County, and that was the blacks, Neil and Roy Black, and the head of the foodways program was an African American woman from Deltaville, and so I mean, it wasn't. So the thing was, I got to, as a kid, and because a lot of these people either lived in my community or went to my church, I got to see a lot of behind the scenes type things about history and the meaning of it in ways that I didn't understand or appreciate as much when I was a student. And it was coming alive for me. But the kicker was that summer, that junior, senior year, with my theater teacher. And she was performing a character. She was a character actor is what they used to call them. Because everybody in Williamsburg, just because they were in costume or clothing, period clothing, didn't mean they were actors. They were just, wearing the clothes and taking you on a tour or showing you the trade or whatever. But there was a particular program that started where they brought in actors who portray real people of the past. And my theater teacher was one of these people, and she was portraying a character named Ann Wager, which is really interesting, because Ann Wager was the headmistress of the Brace School. And the Brace School was the first school in the colony of Virginia designed specifically to educate black children. And she was the headmistress of that school. It started around 1764 and went until 1774. And there are hundreds of children, enslaved mostly, who were being taught to read and write and do mathematics here in Virginia, right? Really interesting. So I'm fascinated because, I'd always been told black people weren't allowed to read and write, which was historically is not true. right? But that's, it became law after Nat Turner burned everything down because he was so good at reading the Bible. But before that, a person, black or white, enslaved or free, would learn to read and write depending on whether or not their work required it, right? So, I digress. I was mesmerized by this performance. And I thought, I want to do that, right? That's a great summer gig. And she told me, you're too young. They won't hire you. I was like, okay. Just so happened that my uncle was the head of HR. And so I asked him about it. He said, oh, they do auditions in the spring. So, come back in the spring and audition for them. The Hampton University runs the program for the black actors. A guy named Rex Ellis, Dr. Ellis, is the one who does the auditions. You can come back and do that then. And I was like, okay, bet. So I showed up at the audition, and the requirement for the audition was to have a headshot and your resume. And I had a headshot and a resume. They didn't say anything about an age. So I went in there. I did my thing. I did a scene from for Colored Girls Who Considered Suicide When the Rainbow's Enough, and blew them away. Got offered a job. 17. And they're like, great, this is the character you're gonna play, and we've assigned you with a UVA. See all these connections, right? UVA professor by the name of Reggie Butler was one of my historians to help me work on the background for this character and help develop to make her real, all the in-depth kind of stuff. And Reggie Butler was going to be my person, and it was all great. And they're like, and you're going to meet with him on April whatever. And I was like, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And why not? Well, I don't graduate until June 12th. And they were floored, but they let me keep my job. And they worked around it, so I came after school, and I came on the weekends to train and to read. And I did it. And that was one of the hardest and the most challenging things, because I can tell you, I had no intention of going into history as a career. Very few people do. If people say, hey, I want to work in museums, I worry about you. Because it's not, really, most of the people that I know in the museum field are not people who say who started out that way. They come into the industry through a lot of different ways, a lot of different career centers, and they get caught up. They get caught up in the real impact that an institution is making. And the same thing kind of happened to me. As I went to school, one of the things, like I said, I loved theater and I loved performance, but I knew my parents were not going to ever allow me to major in theater. Right? So, and I was okay, because I could minor in theater. That was the compromise, right? And I wanted to be a lawyer because I wanted to do social justice. And so it seemed to me at the time that the best option for me was William and Mary and the Marshall with the School of Law. And I went to William and Mary, and it was not what I had hoped. And I got very politically active at the school very early. And some of the things that we talk about and are going to talk about over the course of the next few days in this conference are some of the experiences, some of those legacy experiences that I had at William and Mary. I mean, my first semester in, it was the standard thing that they would do to us back then, right? To try to psych you out. They pulled all 1,300 students into the auditorium, into William and Mary Hall, and they said, now, look to your left, look to your right. I mean, I literally had to put up with that nonsense. Because one of y'all are going to be gone by the end of the first year. I was like, what is that? That's not how but it's like, it ain't going to be me, right? We also had at that time, a sociology professor who was positing that the inclusion of Black and brown students into elite universities was damaging their reputations and dumbing down the university and its standards. And he was making quite a national name for himself with this racist ideology. And so, of course, all 46 of us Black students in the freshman class of 1,300, quite a few tried to sign up for that class. I was not wasting my time on that, right? But there are some of my classmates that poured in there in protest, and some of the white allies that we found, or that they found to do that. Meanwhile, I was off, discovering the universe, right? Freshman in college, literally 10 minutes from my parents' house, who said, pretend like it's 10 hours, don't call us, don't come by, don't bring your laundry, don't want to see you, but at the breaks, the official breaks, that's when we see you. Problem with that is, it's also 3 minutes from my church that I grew up in, so, there was always somebody, trying to see what you're doing if they saw you walking on campus late at night, and you're a freshman, right? And at that time, we could drink at 18. Legally. So I did that. Fast forward, that summer, again, really, that summer at CW, the experience at William and Mary started connecting pieces for me about the past and the present, and that legacy piece. And, then I started doing theater at William and Mary, and writing at William and Mary, got into the writers program there, and was finding my voice, honestly, in a different way. And I really struggled about what I wanted to do with my life. And then second semester of my freshman year, my dorm burned down. Yeah, that happened. In January, 17 degrees outside. Alarms blaring, smoke filling the halls, we're out of the building, dorm burned down. So now I'm like, what happens next? So it's like all these existential things are happening to me as a 17, 18-year-old. And I realized that money wasn't as important anymore. Things weren't as important anymore. It was about the lived experience. It was about the history. It was about the culture. It was about my people. It was about finding peace with each other. And I was committed to that. But I realized that too often, peace on a big scale meant that it always meant that people who looked like me were expected to bury their pain for the greater good. We were always having to bury our pain for the greater good, and yet the pain continued because the rest of the world refused to see it, acknowledge it, or for that matter, even suggest that our pain was actually all in our head. Right? If we'd only just do it the way they said. And one of the things that I developed the second summer is I developed this little saying, that's when I started talking in parables, right? Work for Jesus, let me figure a way to do this. Was that even if my cup is different from yours, what gives you the right to tell me what to put in mine? Right? And so that became sort of the thing that my character said. And I watched the 99% of white visitors who came to Colonial Williamsburg literally ball up in tears. Because this wasn't a depiction of slavery that they expected of, especially given my age. And I did look older, come on, I looked older. But there was they weren't expecting empathy. They were expecting, I guess, what's her name from Gone with the Wind? Not Mammy, but the one, I don't know, not about the baby. It was like, what do you expect? Their expectation of the portrayal. So when they were meeting someone with real feelings and real depth of experience, and who the horror of slavery wasn't what was put on her back, but what she wasn't allowed to be, or what she wasn't allowed to do. Or even the fact that when she told the story about how her mother didn't name her, the master named her. And that, you know, she was lucky because all of her other siblings got sold away. But because she was the same age as the master's daughter, she got to stay with her mother. And just this ongoing, and people were weeping. I mean, literally weeping on the streets of Williamsburg. And I was like, yeah! Right? I mean, because I was accomplishing what they all set out to do. And I got so good at it, and that, you know, the improvisational theater element of that was always so intriguing to me. And, you know, like I said, I was smart, so I was just sopping up the historical research, and every time I turned around, Reggie and Rex and Dylan and everybody else was always giving me new books and new works, and I was reading them like a sponge, incorporating them into the trails. And then I got stuck. And I was like, okay, lawyering doesn't seem like it's gonna work out, because I'm ready to get the hell out of William and Mary. I can't take it socially anymore. Academically, I was okay. Socially, I was tired. And I hadn't been tired like that even in high school. Because I had, I went to Williamsburg, so it was majority white, but I did well in school. I mean, I was the class president. I was Miss Bruton High School, for God's sake. I was the last one for 20 years because they were so mad that a black girl won. That's the honest to God truth. I won Miss Bruton High School for 20 years. They did not hold another Miss Bruton High School pageant for 20 years in my hometown. That's the honest to God truth. Even with all of that, William and Mary was worse. And I said, I can't do any of this anymore. I have to get out of this place, I have to get out of this town, and I'm gonna go be an actor. And that's what I did. I disappeared and became a voice actor, screen, did a little bit of television, little small parts here and there, and actually was able to make a living doing it. But it had a different kind of fulfillment that I was missing. Long answer to your question, but you said you wanted me to talk about background and career, but that's how it all evolved, right? I mean, it all evolved from those experiences, those imprints, if you will, as that young 17-year-old. And then when I finally decided that museums was what I really wanted to do, I went back to school. I went to the Family Legacy School, which was Hampton University, HBCUs, woo-hoo pirate. So I went to Hampton University. I finished my undergraduate and I finished my master's degrees. Finished at the top of my class in both programs and went to work. Went back to work at Williamsburg and shook the tree. And I became the youngest director in their history and the first black woman director at Williamsburg at 29. And so that's the first part of the story. And from there, it gets really interesting.
So I'm going to throw
Another one of my things out. I promise the answer won't be as long.
Well, no, because this speaks to the shaking the tree. It gets really interesting. And I think that's to the meat, right? So it's your sacred cow.
Right.
Right? And that was something that you did at a tenants talk. You were talking about the sacred cow. And I think that we need to have you talk about the sacred cow now so that we can sort of start to weave our being here into a way that creates them.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Talk about
So
the
weaves
sacred cow.
into.
Yeah,
So-
talk about the sacred cow.
So, sacred cows. It was a TEDx talk that I did, and I was feeling I was in a very special place at that particular one, and I talked about how literally the people and the ideas that we put on pedestals in culture, and the impact of that, and the problem with having sacred cows And I don't mean any disrespect to anyone of Hindu faith. But the point at that time was, when we do this, if we learn to actually milk the cow, we find greater nourishment, was the sort of underlying point that I was trying to make in that case. And I'll give you a perfect example of how, so this is the funny thing, because I work in the public history space. Some of you are in academia, some of you are community members, etc. Here's what happens in my space, public history space, right? I mean, people come to us looking either for reinforcement or enlightenment. That's pretty much it. Family fun, that's kind of there too. You know, gotta do something with the kids, right? But they come, and we in the museum space have to deal with them in sort of three spheres. There's the forensic history. It is the what we know from oral history, from archaeology documents, etc. The recordable, that passed down thing on oral tradition, etc. There is the forensic history. And then there's this thing called heritage. Now, heritage is a powerful thing. And heritage is what is agreed upon within a community. Heritage are the stories that we tell each other for cohesion. It may or may not be directly connected to the forensic. And then last but not least is the memory. The things we experienced ourselves that become the things that we pass on to somebody else that may or may not be collaborated or with the forensic. And I'm going to give you a perfect example of how heritage takes over and can do so for a really long time. How many people in this room have heard George Washington could never tell a lie and he had wooden teeth? Raise your hands. Okay. What about chop down that cherry tree? All of that is heritage making. None of it is forensically real. None of it is quote unquote true. You know how we know that? Because we got 2 sets of George Washington's false teeth in collections. One set's at Mount Vernon, the other set's at the American Dental Association. We have George Washington's records between him and his French dentist who made his false teeth. We have ledgers that show where he paid the dentist to remove the teeth of certain enslaved people to make his false teeth, along with the ivory. Now, sometimes he would give a little bit of money to the slave for taking a particular tooth, especially if it was a molar. Y'all with me? How many of you heard that? Oh, y'all are better, because of course y'all are academics, of course. But the point being is, the general public still believes those 3 things 250 years later. That is how powerful heritage can be, and why it is often so difficult, even with forensic fact, to help them build new memory around forensic history so they can build new heritage. It is part of the reason why so many people were apoplectic for a variety of reasons when the monuments started coming down. Because it was about heritage making. And listening or hearing other voices in those conversations was extremely difficult. So when I talk about sacred cows, we have to be willing to recognize or to look at what of those things, again, are they forensically supported, or did we come up with it thinking it was building cohesion? And more often than not, building that cohesion didn't really involve minority communities, whether they were Irish or anything else. It just didn't. And I believe we are harmed by that, because we've never been able to really address the inconsistencies of our ideals with the application of how we live.
So the conference is about university studying slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So within the context of that sacred cow, within the context of the kinds of work that we're trying to do, in your mind, what are the conversations that need to be had at that space? The sacred cow, I mean, that institution considers is a benevolent institution. It offers a larger good. What kind of roadmarks can you offer for the ways in which one can come to, in that particular space, seeing it in that context, to those kinds of authentic truths?
I mean, without a doubt, I mean, our institutions of higher learning have always had a very special place, a very privileged place in American society. And that privilege is born of an idea. At one time, university education was only the purview of the elite. And then here, Jefferson said something to the effect that an enlightened democracy has to be an educated citizenry, right? And so that's part of the mantra of building the university here at the University of Virginia. And all of that is really, really lovely. The democratization of education. What's interesting about it is that when we think about these schools and we think about these universities, somebody had to build them, right? Somebody toiled to keep the students comfortable, especially during the periods of high elite value, right? Some schools, like Georgetown, for example, actually sold slaves, I think it was like 270 something, to maintain the school. Just sold off these human beings who had been there, in that area for generations. And reconciling and reckoning with that history is often really difficult. And particularly in the last 5 years, the conversations that I've seen among peers and communities about what universities could or should do has varied widely. Most of it, because you're a university, it always starts with research, right? It always starts with, who were they? How do we best memorialize them? What I would say too is that very few universities take that next important step of, what are you doing to reconcile that past with the current student population, right? I mean, if you're still doing harm, and that was a huge conversation that was had, because I was asked to help lead the naming commission for the University of Richmond, to co-chair that. And that was quite an experience, right? Because, you've got donors and alumni who were wedded to the names of these buildings, and yeah, we want to know the history, but we don't change anything, right? Don't change anything. I mean, it was really difficult. It was really, really difficult work, but they did through a wonderful process, and it was painful at times. I mean, really painful for the students. It was painful for those, but and I get why they asked an outsider to help. Because I could kind of step back and look at what was happening at the school as incidents were occurring, as in any period of change from the status quo, racial violence occurred on that campus. Direct, sort of physical, but mostly emotional violence that was being committed deliberately by other students. I mean, it's like this legacy thing, right? And it was really, really challenging. And I know that those are among the conversations that you all are going to have. It's so much easier to talk about, the wonderful research work like with the Women Project. I know there are others, but I'm just kind of favorable to that one. And the extraordinary work that's been done there. No disrespect, UVA, I know y'all been doing it too. Everybody's been doing it. Emory University did a lot of work. Like I said, Georgetown, I spent some time up with Georgetown around this topic. And I've really been, the scholarship is unquestionable, but it always comes back to, but what are you doing to really look at and break down systemic issues on that campus? What support, what methodologies, what code of conducts are you putting into place? And it's always interesting to me, because this is what I hear. This is what we heard at the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, right? We're not going to change the name Ole Miss because it's generational, even though Ole Miss has connotations of plantation and yada, yada, yada. And there were faculty who were like, can we just have umiss.edu, for God's sake, as our email instead of Ole Miss? Mm-hmm. I mean, something that simple was rejected at one point, right? And the rituals that have become a part of fraternity life on that campus. One of the rituals for the Kappa Alphas, y'all know who they are, right? That's Robert E. Lee's boys, right? One of the rituals on the campus was to put a noose on the James Meredith statue and to pee on it as a part of their initiations. So, I mean, if a university fails to acknowledge or deal with those kinds of egregious things under the guise of freedom of speech and freedom of academic, y'all know y'all got these really interesting things about academic freedom to pursue an academic idea. Well, if the academic idea is crap and you know it's not based on any real science, why would you allow that to happen? You know? And I know they're tenured folks who, you know, been around for a minute and maybe having a moment. Because there's a lot of academics right now that are having a real moment. And they are struggling with this, and I'm choosing my words very carefully here. There are some academics who are really struggling with this, with whiteness. Not European descendancy, whiteness, the meaning of whiteness. And because whiteness is under attack, not European descended people, the concept of whiteness as a form of harm, generational trauma-inducing harm on other people is what's under attack. And so I've watched, even in some academic circles, folks come to the rallying defense of the indefensible sometimes. I know we don't have those people in this room. Y'all are here to talk about university studying slavery. That's really kind of cool. The USS, that's great, right? But when you leave here, I hope, in addition to thinking about best practices about how to engage descendant communities, thinking about what are the next steps of your research and the needs, and looking for corrective measures and looking at institutional policy. I mean, all of this has to come into play. Otherwise, it's just an academic exercise at the end of the day. And maybe, you know, honestly, you know, you do have that luxury in the academic world, in academia. You have that luxury. In the public history side of it, we don't. We are every day confronted with what is happening on those streets, because the visitors come to us with all of it, and they aren't going to sit in the classroom with us. They are bringing all of that with them, and we have to engage in a dialogue to help them build their forensic that you create in your research, right? But we help them build an understanding, build new memories to help them understand the forensic better, so that we can, in fact, create a much better shared heritage that is based more not on the memories we want, but on the facts that we experience. Does that make sense? Okay. So we've done sacred cows, we've done, okay.
I'm gonna open it up to I've got some else, but I'm gonna let them ask a few questions.
Okay, all right.
Does anyone have a question? Because I can keep going.
So I just want to know, in your I feel exhausted and I feel very hopeless. And it's like I and like a bunch of other, Black people on this planet are fighting for, things that the same things that you're talking about, but it's like an endless fight. So how do you stop yourself from giving up, from falling into that hole of just depression? If that's too personal, I can.
Oh, no, it's a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. When I was 18, when I was younger and going through that period of exhaustion, I ran. I mean, that's basically what I did when I decided to go off and be an actor. I don't want to do that anymore, but here's what happened. Because I'm a dark-skinned Black woman with, a fuller body, and I don't have straight teeth, right? There are only certain roles that were offered to me. Even though, I had classical training in theater, I had an amazing ability to do voices. I could do just about any accent you asked for and be really good at it. I only had to hear it like maybe a day. If I heard it for a day, I mastered it, right? So that's why I've got really a lot of work in radio, because I was such a good listener. So I could do the voices, and it didn't matter what I looked like, right? But at the end of the day, what helped me is the village. I had friends who were experiencing it too, and together we found joy. You've heard it, Black girl magic, right? Black boy joy. You must have this, because guess what? Our ancestors had it. They deployed it every chance they got. White people misunderstood it and say, oh, look at the happy Negroes. It was our form of resistance is in your joy. And once I understood that part of it, all of the horrible things, and let me tell you, when you go into the historical record and you read the documentable horrible things that other human beings did to other human beings, you can be in a perpetual state of rage. And for a while I was, especially when I was also dealing with the same kinds of things in the academic community. But even with our little 46 Black people in the freshman class that we had been married, believe it or not, and honestly, a good third of them did not align with us. They aligned with whiteness because that's what they knew and that's where they thought they had protection, which is always an interesting thing. I'm not racist, I have a Black friend. Yeah, probably because you're Black friend. Right? I shouldn't have said that. Let's get back to the thing. So the thing is, there's 46 of us, about 30 of us knew how to hang and how to find joy. And these literally are friends of mine to this day. Even though I didn't finish, and yeah, about a third of us didn't finish. Not a third, it wasn't that high. Because their mamas and daddies wouldn't let them. My parents were so upset when I told them I wasn't going back to William Mary. And I said, I just want to be an actor. And they said, okay, we'll give you 3 semesters to figure it out. And if you come back within 3 semesters, we'll pay for you to go to school wherever you want. I was like, okay. Well, I didn't go back for 3 years before I decided, really figured it out. Actually, was it 6 years? I forgot, 6 years. It was 6 years. So from 20 to 26, I did not go to school. I worked as an actor, had part-time jobs to fill in the gaps when I needed it, and just experience life. So everybody's path is different. If you need to go off that path for a minute for sanity, it's okay. Talk to your mom and daddy. You're 20, right? But yeah, it really does come down to finding the allies, finding the helpers, and knowing how to find joy. You have got to step away from it sometimes so that it strengthens you for when you go back on out there. It's just like, the geese that fly in formation. That head geese is never there all the time. But you don't know that. When he starts to get tired, you know what he does? He slowly goes back and this one comes forward. And they just keep crossing each other like that as they make their journey. Y'all know that? That's how geese fly. That's how you gotta fly. You're welcome. My 20-year-old son doesn't agree with me, but
Another question?
in the back?
You talked a lot about universities, the very overt sense of racism and how they act and the names. But like coming from a really old school in Texas, like the oldest school in Texas, it's not, it's like very non-overt. So how do you like go for it? How do you account?
I didn't hear the fullness of your question. I heard something about overt racism. I heard Texas.
Yeah. So we come from the oldest school in Texas,
You come from the oldest school in Texas, okay?
and a lot of the policies and things they do, it's not very much overt racism, like kind of how the examples you were given.
Uh-huh,
But it's still racism, and we see it, and we feel it, and we definitely feel like that's a of whiteness,
uh-huh.
supremacies on campus. So how do you attack that if they're not being very overt about it? Can you specifically-
Well, that's the excuse, right? I mean, racism is water fountains with separate names and violent acts and so forth. So the idea that racism can exist as a psychological form, right, is really difficult for some people to grasp that. Because it's not viewed as something that is systemic but individual. That comes from a position, really a luxury position. When people, it's like, well, racism isn't nearly as bad as it used to be. It's just changed its form because legally you're not allowed to do certain things anymore, right? Legally you can't make me sit at the back of the bus. Instead, what you can do is make me feel so bad about myself because of all the other little things that may be said and done that I'll go sit back there by myself anyway. So how do you deal with that? And I don't think it has anything to do with Texas being an oldest institution in Texas. Texas is special. Texas are really, I just find it so incredibly interesting that, to combat feelings about 1619, and regardless how you feel about the 1619 project and its historical veracity, and there are clearly some issues there, but it sparked a conversation. But in response to that, what did Texas do? Was it Texas 1839 or 1830? What is that? What was that thing? But it's basically 1836, yeah. The year that they leave Mexico because they want to keep slavery? Are you kidding me? That's the type of stuff that you're talking about. It's this subtleness that isn't subtle at all for anybody that knows what it looks like, right? So how do you deal with it? It's the same. The answer is the same, honey. The answer is the same. But in that one, I think it behooves us to, in those cases, you have to do what Mr. Rogers said. You got to find your allies and your helpers in space like that. It's got to be those European Americans who understand it, who can recognize it, and who can call it out in their peers, and not just calling it out. Calling it out is the easy thing. What it takes is that extra dialogue of building an empathy. That's what's missing in all of this. We are at the point of such anger that we don't know how to embrace the empathy or to see the humanity in each other, because that's so much easier to do, right? If I strip my enemy of his humanity, then I can be as inhumane as I choose. And I will justify it every single time. And that's the space that we're in. But here's the thing, this is not new space, we've been here before. We've been here before. Anytime there are periods of long progress and progression towards the social, that arc towards justice, there is always a violent recoil from regressives. Always. And the longer that progressive period goes, the more violent the regression is, but it's quicker. And I would argue that's where we're at right now. We're just at the beginning. We're just at the beginning of the real violence from the regressives. But it won't last that as long as it did, say, from Jim Crow. Simply because we've been around for 50 years with progressing. rights out to all, and there are more people who have been marginalized in one way or another who are coming to the fore and are participating and building the coalitions that make that matter. But you know, I'm always fascinated that what drives it is fear. You tap into someone's fear, it has an extraordinary power that is far more likely to bring out the ugliest thing in people than if you pull out their hope. Hope is lasting. Fear is exhausting and murderous at the end of the day. That's how I stay hopeful. That's how maybe, you know, I wax poetic sometimes about stuff like that, which drives my 16-year-old crazy. She's like, Mom, why don't you psychoanalyze everything or give me a historical lesson about it? I hate history.
Thank you. It's been a really fascinating conversation. And you talked a little bit about public historians being fun. And I'm wondering, as a museum professional, what do you see as, in this time you just described that we're going through right now, what is the ideal role of the museum can play? And the most powerful role the museum can play? And how can it play that role?
Right, so, I mean, we're having that conversation right now at JYF. I've been at Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, hasn't been 3 years yet. And I lost, 9 months because of COVID. I started in January of 2020, 6 weeks later we were closed, right? And had to navigate all of that. So when I talk about museums being on the front line, the first things museums have to do too is recognize the harm that we have caused. And that conversation at my current institution has been really hard for people because, this was a place that for 25 years advertised itself as history is fun. I kid you not, that was the website. historyisfun.com. So coming to terms with what the institutional harm might be and the subtle yet unintentional ways that harm was also caused, right? And I'll give you an example. The museum did a major, obviously for the 1607 400, they did a major renovation, got a new building, major renovation of the galleries, redid all of that. They've done several refreshes over the past 15 years of those galleries. But there's a section when you first walk in and it's talking about, and by the way, the mission changed first in 2012 and then again in got tweaked in 2016, hasn't changed since 2016. But the mission of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation is to help visitors explore and understand the convergence of cultures that came together at Jamestown and how together they formed a new nation through the revolution. It's convergence of culture. Oh, and the legacies bequeathed to the nation. That's our mission, right? Well, history is fun, so the museum rarely talked about legacy issues of these periods. You would walk into the main gallery. We do have, living history areas outside. There's the Paspahegh Town, there is the James Fort recreation, and then there are the 3 ships recreation at the Jamestown site. At Yorktown, it's much, much better because that was redone in 2017. But let me just tell you what you see when you come into Jamestown, in the main gallery. You walk in, and there's all of this information on the archaeology of all of the 30 different townships that made up the Powhatan Confederacy. And that word township is not used lightly. 1,000 to 3,000 people are living in each of these communities that are stable. These are not nomadic peoples. These are woodland, Algonquin-speaking peoples. And they have their towns, right? So we talk about that in the beginning through this archaeology. And then you move to an area where they introduce Central West Africans, or Angola. And here's the thing. Both the indigenous materials as well as then it becomes like dioramas, right? And they're both behind glass. And there is a single recreation of a like Angolan house, a roundhouse. And there's a black female figure sitting on a stool in front of the house with a pipe, a long pipe. And then there's a man behind the house, near where a field is, and he's got, like hunting a deer on the back of them. And the backdrop is just a vast sea of tan and red, like they're in the middle of the desert. And on the other side is the Native American display, also behind glass, with these, life-size figures. They're in the woods on a hunting party, and there's a singular house, and there's fish, and the Indian woman has a baby strapped to her back, and the man is in the woods with a bow and arrow. And then you continue on this pathway, and you enter the English street. And people are hanging out the windows, and there are storefronts, and you see what I'm saying? Are y'all getting what happened? So unintentionally, what they've done is they've isolated indigenous peoples, not only as peoples of the past because they're in glass, but they have isolated them from the very rich cultures for which they are a part. There is no part of Angola that is a desert. I mean, they didn't even get that right. So when I first took some board members and some staff through that space to see it through that lens, they were shocked. I mean, and hurt. I mean, like, oh my God, we did not intend. I know you didn't intend it, but this is what happens. And you're portraying both of these as if these are dead cultures. You took them completely out of context. And that's why it's damaging. We do these things in our museum spaces. So until we can address that in our spaces and have these conversations and help our staff learn what effective dialogue with visitors means, we will never be able to really build empathy. And it takes work. And yeah, there are people who have pushed back on the staff. Like, oh, we don't want to do that, Boards tend to be far more conservative than staff, so then there's that dynamic. And then when you throw in political change that wants to perpetuate potentially more of a heritage making versus a forensic, things get really messy. But we have to be committed to the work. And it starts with really investigating where the harm can come. I was sharing with our Secretary of Education, in fact, because at Jamestown we realized that some objects that were purchased in the early 2000s, legally purchased, Benin plots, right, were purchased at Jamestown with the help of our colleagues at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. We were able to acquire some Benin bronzes from a reputable dealer and all of that. And when they purchased it, they also knew that it was a part of the 1897 expedition. And they thought that was cool at the time. Well, as time goes on, it's not cool. Now, the 1897 expedition for the community members, this was a period when the British Empire, the English, went into Benin, and it was during a high holy season. And the king, as well as the guards, had said, you may not enter the city. The city, mind you. I mean, we have images of Benin City, and it was a remarkable place. The Portuguese, the Spaniards, everybody knew about Benin City. I mean, this was a massive, wealthy, multi-layered, multi-story buildings in Africa, in Central West Africa. Anyway, they had been told, don't go into the city. And these guys, this group, decided they're going to go in anyway in the middle of the high season with the chief. and they were killed. These 12 men were killed. In response to that, British Empire sent several ships and 1,200 troops to Benin, bombed the city, stole the Benin plaques that had been in place for over 5,000 years, some of those plaques, that told the history and culture of the people. And these plaques were dispersed around the Western world. So here's the thing. It's real easy to say that there are cultures that have no culture. Well, they don't have any real art. Yeah, they did. It just all got stolen and looted. The African continent, 90% of her cultural assets are in Western European museums. 90% of her cultural antiquities are in Western European nations. We, as museums, have created harm. So I went to my board and I said, we must return them. Nigeria has established a commission. We are going to load up this information so that they can begin rebuilding the cultural heritage. The British Museum has decided they are not going to do that because, well, we're just concerned about how they're going to be cared for. Dude, they were there for 5,000 years before you showed up. They know how to take care of their stuff. But it's that kind of arrogance that our museum world inflicts on communities time and time again, as if we're so. One of the things that we've in trying to repair relationships and with our Virginia indigenous communities and others, and trying to repair and do right, you know, instead of us going into communities asking what we can extract, we're asking communities, what can we share? What can we help put into your community that will help you tell the story the way you want, about building trust? And what that does is that we are able to co-curate together. We're able to have more than one thing. We're able to recognize, and it's tough, but having to have that conversation with board members and with the secretary has been an interesting dynamic, because they're learning even as they're doing the things that they do. I have tried to use it as an opportunity as well to say, hey, did you know this? And I love watching that moment of, no, I didn't. You know, so everything doesn't have to be a fight. It can be an eye-opening, exact excision. One last question, and then I think we're done. You got two down there. I've just taken over the thing. See what I'm saying? Plus, it's after 6 o'clock. I can do what I want. Hello there. How are you? You're about to ask a controversial question. Okay.
From your perspective, in your work as a historian and dealing with museums, and also your background with arts, what is your personal take on what should be done, what should happen, both locally and nationally, with these Confederate monuments?
Did everybody hear his question? No? He basically asked me my personal opinion about what should happen with Confederate monuments that are being taken down. What is my personal feeling about that? And my personal feeling about it is communities put them up, and communities should have the right to decide whether they come down. Taking down statues is not something new in the American lexicon. People say, we don't tear down statues and we're not the Taliban. No, we're not. But guess what? We've done it many times before. And communities far and wide, removing statues is not something new. That what's new is that we're looking at particular ones. And like I said, if a community, like the community that my grandfather grew up in a little town called Cuthbert, Georgia, outside of Dothan, his little town literally has 3,500 people in it. Of that 3,500 people that my town where my grandfather grew up, the poverty rate among the African American community is 56%. They make up 60% of the community. White wealth there in that little town is 10 times the average of the black community. And guess what's in the middle of their town square, right across the street from the courthouse? A Confederate statue. So as the young people said in the American summer, that's what I like. We talk about the Arab Spring, the American summer of 2020. Young woman said, and I wish I could remember her name, but she said, in response to that question, where would you like me to put the statue of the person who rapes your mother or your grandmother? And ultimately, that's what's been asked, right? You know, you've turned into a hero, persons who literally are responsible for perpetuating a caste system that made murder and death and rape and mutilation acceptable for any deemed infraction. Now, you know, you can argue all day long, well, no, I mean, the average good old boy from Southampton County just wanted to, you know, protect his community against the invading armies of the North. Shoot me now. We all know that aspirations can also be a grand motivator. But again, even in those cases, there are helpers. And this is the thing that's so fascinating to me. Y'all know, and I want to end on that one, y'all know about James Longstreet, right? One of the great Civil War generals, Confederate generals. Great as in, really did a lot of great stuff on the battlefield. Did you know there's not one statue of James Longstreet in the United States? Oh, I'm sorry, except for Gettysburg. Did you know that? Why did they not put up a statue of Longstreet? You know why? Because after the war, Longstreet said, okay, cool. Slaves are now free. That's the law of the land. I'm going to help them out. And he did. He became a Republican. He was for equal rights and protecting schools, actually led in the big riot down there in New Orleans where they put up the statue down there of Robert E. Lee and others, and particularly the monument to white supremacy and the usurpation in 1876. It was Longstreet who tried to put that down. One statue to James. So don't talk about the power of the battlefield. It was about the power of an idea. So again, I think communities should have that choice. For me, I'm glad that my community decided to take it down. And that must mean it's 8 o'clock.
That's my child calling from Boulder.
Oh!
Why would you ever hang up like this?
Yeah, they are funny, aren't they?
So, thank you, Christy.
Thank you.
It's been a
Thank
wonderful-
you.
So I have been asked to do one piece of business. Your badges, keep them. If you show a badge tomorrow, you'll get a program.
Where are we supposed to be tomorrow?
Tomorrow is at Newcomb Hall.
Newcomb Hall.
Yes, Newcomb Hall. Kurt, do you want to talk a little bit about tomorrow morning, or is it enough to say, be at Newcomb Hall at 8:30?